In this episode of the Data Exchange, I speak with my friend Amy Heineike. She is the principal product architect at Primer.ai, a startup building machines that can read and write. Primer recently used their technology to build COVID-19 Primer, which you can find at COVID19Primer.com. Amy Heineike, Principal Product Architect at Primer.ai. Welcome to the Data Exchange podcast, finally.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I had another podcast, the data show, way back when, and I kept wanting to have you on, but then I had other requests at the time, like speaking and stuff. I didn't want to confuse the situation.
Not too much at the same time. Well, I'm glad we've made it happen at last.
Yeah. So we'll talk a lot about what you're doing now around COVID-19 at Primer, but as a way to introduce you to the audience, so you were one of the first people who basically was studying topics at the intersection of social science and computer science. You started a degree way back when on computational social science. So two quick questions. So what was the field back then? And what is it today, as far as you can tell as an observer from afar?
Yeah, so I think, I came from a mathematics background, and in the beginning, I was really interested in kind of the possibilities of modeling and the, especially kind of complex systems analysis and what we kind of understood about nonlinear dynamics and kind of the processes that made. So I was really fascinated in, say, cities and how transportation networks affect them. But when I was getting started, there was just very little data. So when we were looking at cities, for example, this was the job I had before I started that PhD. To understand a transportation network, you would hire a team of people who would stand at the side of the road with clickers and count cars going past. And they would have survey data or census data every 10 years that you could use to calibrate at scale. So very, very sparse data, but some very interesting kind of mathematical models. And then I think what was so interesting as the kind of, the big data era came in was that suddenly you could be much more observational. So you could say, well, what data do we have out there and what can that tell us? So I think there's some places where that intersection is very interesting. Can you build a simple model that helps you understand the dynamics of what's going on that matches the observed patterns that you see in large scale data? But certainly that's been the shift. So more and more richer and richer observational data to help us understand the systems.
So you were, if smart cities and sensors were available back then, you would have a lot more to work with.
We would have had a lot more to work with. That's right. And I haven't been involved in that field for a while, so I'm kind of fascinated where they've gotten to now. But there's floods and floods of data to understand how people move around cities and use the environment with them that's there.
So Amy, just so generally speaking, at a high level, some of those techniques then, would they apply to the things that we hear about these days in epidemiological models?
Yeah, that's right. So the ways that people interact with each other and kind of sketching out the patterns of how people interact with each other are very useful for epidemiological
This
models.
contact tracing stuff, right?
Contact tracing stuff. Yeah, I've done a small amount of research some time ago. I'm definitely not an expert on the current models. But one of the things that you learn from studying, especially kind of social networks and the structure of those, is that there are often key people. So like those super spreaders or the people who have a huge number of contacts. And so the balance of, do diseases spread kind of step by step slowly, or do they leap? Do they make these kind of giant leaps and then suddenly explode? The pattern is not necessarily linear. So getting your head around that, it helps to have kind of good modeling. And I think, one of the things that I imagine is an important kind of thing to understand when you're figuring out how to respond to something like a pandemic is understanding what patterns of spread are you seeing mostly? Is it mostly the one-on-one kind of family connections and then the big super spreader events? How much of your effort should be directed at containing the big events? How much should be at the small events?
And so let's fast forward to Primer. So
Yeah,
Primer is focused on building language applications, so specifically helping
yeah,
people wade through large amounts of text and
mm,
basically language understanding at scale in some ways, right? So
yeah, that's
so you and Sean Gorley start when this company started. Was language? I'm trying to remember. Language has
right.
always been important to enterprises, right? So text mining, but this was long. This was a few years before deep learning and transformers
Yeah.
came upon the scene, right? So, but actually, when you folks were starting Primer, my reaction was, hasn't that been done? Are there enough text mining companies already? So,
Mhm.
what was the thesis behind Primer? How old is Primer, by the way?
So we started in 2015. So we're
Okay.
5 years old.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, what was the
Um,
thesis?
what was the thesis? So we, yeah, I mean, so we've had a lot of text data around for a while, as you said. I think
And there were tech startups. There was a generation of tech
there was a
startups, right?
generation of them. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think the the promise of them is not fulfilled yet, though, right? They felt like there was still a lot to be done. So any company you talk to has some pile of documents sitting around that they wish they could make better sense of. They probably should have read, but they haven't, or they don't know how to get the information out of that. And so um, yeah, we were fascinated by the possibility of bringing new ideas to how you could tackle that. And so one thing that we actually wanted to try out was doing text generation, so describing the content of document sets using natural language to make it accessible to people so they could use it in more ways. Um, so I think when we started, it was right when Spacey launched, actually. So
Right. Right.
and that as
And
a
I just had Matt on the podcast.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so there were advances, right? So Spacey was just a much more powerful, easy to use um, set of kind of models than we'd had before. So absolutely, in the last couple of years, we've then seen these enormous leaps forward, right? With the latest generation of models coming through, but there has been kind of continued progress.
And then I guess Amy also just highlights the difference between tools and models and product. Because I
Yeah,
think, as you point out, I think that generation that came before Primer, they may have had some good tools and models, but it wasn't in a way that enterprises could necessarily consume or use in an easy way, right?
yeah, yeah, that's right. Um, so tools and so I think there's kind of one example of this I think would be something like the idea of organization extraction. So this is a task where you basically want to take a document and say which companies were mentioned in the text. In 2015, the state of the art models probably scored about 60%, 65% accuracy. So there were models, and the idea of wanting to do this task, extract company names from text, possible, but it was very, very noisy. So if you wanted to build a product around it, if you wanted to be able to, look across a bunch of documents and find out which companies were being mentioned, who they were being mentioned from, like extract key information about them, your main problem developing that product would be how do you handle all the noise? So the 40% of the detected things that don't make any sense. The latest generation of models are getting, I think, in the 90s. Like it's mostly correct. There's very few errors.
Actually, yeah,
Um,
you're right. So now I'm trying, as you were saying that, I remember you had to have a product that was much more human in the loop,
Much
right?
more human in the loop. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and you had to spend a lot of time thinking about how to handle all those edge cases. So do those errors completely overwhelm the product to make it useless, or is it still useful that you managed to find to structure so much of it? So yeah, as it gets more accurate, it gets a bit easier because you're not having to face that overwhelming noise. Um,
And let's talk about the what you folks are doing around COVID-19. this website. So what's the origin story of the website? Were you guys just brainstorming for ways on how to use your technology to help the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of us at Primer who are kind of science geeks in some sense, who came from scientific backgrounds or follow areas of the literature closely. So we've in the past done a bunch of analysis on scientific papers and used it as kind of a testing ground for different algorithms. So when the pandemic broke out, we were obviously thinking very hard about what we could do in response. So was there anything kind of constructive we could do to positively help it? And one thing that struck us, one thing that struck us was just how incredibly fast the science was coming out. So we decided to build the site, I think around mid-March. We built the guts of it within about a week because we were able to pull in so much of the bits and pieces that we'd done before. But at that time, there were maybe 1,500, 1,600 papers and preprints that had been released, which was still pretty staggering, right? So the disease was only named, I think, in the end of January. So by mid-March, to have actually 1,500 papers had been written by doctors and scientists around the globe was kind of staggering already. And we realized that that did present a challenge to people. So how on earth do you read that many papers, or how do you have a sense of what's going on in that literature? And that's what, these kind of the kind of technology we can build makes it a bit easier. It gives you ways to explore it. So a small team of us basically got together and pulled the site together in mostly in a week, and then we had another week of iterations before we launched it. Now I think we're at over 27,000 papers and preprints have been written by the scientific community, which is, again, just really, really staggering. So a very, very wide range of research into the disease, into how it spreads, the kind of modeling that you were talking about before.
So the website, I believe the address is COVID19 Primer.com, and I encourage our listeners to check it out. So a couple of questions. The first is, do you folks also study in non-English papers, number one? And number two, what exactly are you extracting from the papers? So describe kind of the models that I have one paper, here's one paper, so what are you trying to extract from that one paper?
Right. So for non-English, we have not looked at non-English papers. A lot of the scientific literature does seem to be in English, but I'm sure there's some fascinating stuff that's not. So what are we extracting? So for an individual paper, we do. What do we do for individual papers? So we do some metadata analysis. We do some processing. So we try and see if there's basically a shorter summary we could write of the paper that we could use in the generated text. The more interesting analysis we do is more at the aggregate level. So can we group and structure the data and kind of tell a story across many documents? So we do classification. So we basically came up with a set of research categories, and we've built a classifier that can take a document and say which of those categories it belongs in. We do a clustering, so we can say what groups of papers seem to be similar to each other. And so you can go in and find kind of emerging areas of research and go and explore those.
Yeah, you do this topic model, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I think that can be kind of fascinating. So I think as time has shifted, we've seen the different kind of areas change. So I think when we were first building it, a big chunk of the research was on the Diamond Princess cruise ship. So when that incident happened, there was a lot of research trying to make sense of it. But as time has gone on, there's obviously a lot of progress in kind of the pharmaceutical side and getting vaccine trials set up and running. So there's very different groupings. we've also done, so I think one of the most interesting things that we've been able to do is joining the research with the news and social conversation around it. So we're able, so we have a.
So how do you guys do that? That's got to be like messy, huh?
It's messy, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a corpus of, I think, over 1 billion English language news articles. At the moment, we get about 200,000 new papers a day. New articles a day. We're just joining at the moment on the URLs. So can we find a news article that links to a paper? And there's a number of different ways that papers can get referenced. So they have DOI.org kind of references, and there's also kind of journal links. So we try and find if any of them match. We also do the same with Twitter. So we basically search for people linking to papers and sharing them. And we found there's a lot of content there. So I think we've got over 15,000 news articles talking about the literature, and 750,000 tweets that we've discovered so far. So with the news, we do other analysis. So we run that through our named entity recognition system, so NER. So we find people's names in particular, and then we try and match them back and say, are they authors of papers? So the author name resolution is probably one of the trickier,
I bet. Yeah,
kind of, right. And then my favorite piece is actually we also do quotation extraction. So we find quotes and we try and attribute them. So which person said this quote, and then because we can link it back, we can basically say, okay, this author of these papers was quoted in these news articles saying these things. So that's very rich. So it's very hard to read academic papers as a layperson. But when people describe their own papers, they do a very nice job of contextualizing it. So like the author quote is kind of gold when you can find that and surface it.
And especially over time, as someone who's interacted a lot with the press, right? So the first interview you do, you can't really quite describe it well. But then by the 4th, 5th, 10th interview, you've got it down, right? So I imagine if you folks also have a timestamp for when the interview took place, you can get better and better quotes. So the classic thing, Amy, that people do with papers is the citation. Do you guys look at the citation kind of relationship?
We haven't looked at citations, and so for breaking papers, there aren't people who've cited them yet.
Right, exactly.
Right. So it's useful to find out who they cited, what it's building on. But we haven't done that, and I think that there's a lot that could be interesting. So there's a number of other efforts that people have put out there. So there's some other really kind of interesting sites to explore. So we were just featured in a piece that Nature wrote, where the journal Nature, where they basically listed a number of the different tools that people have created. So I think there's a number of kind of question answering services. So those are kind of focused on, if you want to go in and say, is there an answer for how effective this specific drug is, then it will find papers that kind of answer that specifically. The take that we took on COVID-19 Primer was more of a, can we tell a bigger story about the kind of areas of research where there's a lot of activity, and for the recent papers, ones where there's been a bit of buzz. So help me kind of direct my focus if I want to get kind of a broad understanding of what's happening. So we haven't gone into that analysis. Actually, one other thing, so going back to your quotes point, so the quotations, we haven't done a lot of analysis of those quotes, but I think that there probably are some very interesting stories if you were to take individuals and analyze their quotations. So one thing that we've done on the site that's kind of fun and a bit of an Easter egg actually, is that, so one of the struggles we've had as time has gone on, we've had more and more and more content fitting into the site. So we designed it when there were 1,500 papers, and now there's 27,000. So on the people tab in particular, we had a ton of information there initially. So for every single person, we kind of listed all their papers, every time they've been in a news article, every quote they ever had, and that page would just blow up the browser. Like it would take forever to load. So what we've ended up doing is we've cut that down so that page doesn't have as much information, but there is a little download link where you can get an Excel file of every single quotation of a paper author about in news articles.
So if I'm an author, that's kind of a good vanity service right there.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to try out some fun NLP processing, you want to like an interesting data set, go to the site, go to the people page, and there's a little download link. Get all of these quotes and see, is there some kind of interesting story where you can see the progression of what they're talking about, or kind of changes in the language. I think it's also kind of an interesting tool for trying to understand where different scientists are coming from, right? So, does it tell us something about their areas of expertise? Does it tell us something about the point of view they're bringing?
And so, Amy, you mentioned something earlier about a summary. So, so summarization is one of these NLP tasks that has been around for a while. So, for the people who don't follow NLP that closely, so how good are these summarization algorithms at the moment?
Yes, so there's a few different.
And by the way, how do you measure good?
Yeah. So
what is the metric?
What's the metric? Well, there's better metrics coming out. It's definitely
it's a human, right? So you probably have like a human judge to say, is this a good summary? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. So there's a couple of different kinds of summarization. So the classic summarization is you take a long piece of text and you want to get out a short piece of text. And actually, I can talk a bunch about that. That's a super fun challenge. Another form of summarization is basically effectively write a report that describes what's happening in a corpus. So, just basically convey information in natural language, convey facts in natural language. So if you go onto the COVID-19 site, there's a daily briefing. So if you click on that tab, it's basically a natural language.
That's amazing. Actually, that daily briefing is quite amazing.
Yeah. So what that's doing is it's highlighting things that we've discovered in the corpus. So that text is not in any other text. It's not summarizing one article. What it's doing is giving you a written briefing, and that's a more accessible way, I think, of coming into the.
So let's take a step back in this daily briefing. So.
Yep.
Can you tell the model that generates the daily briefing, I want you to write in the style of J.K. Rowling, as opposed to, I mean, what level of style do you have control over the way this daily briefing is written? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, in a way that the tone of that is Primer's editorial voice, right? It's how we wanted to talk about the text. So the trickiest piece, in fact, for that is deciding, and this is through statistics, what kind of facts are the ones that you'd want to surface to somebody. So what information do we want to highlight? And then
but it's still language, so there's still writing style. So you and I might describe a certain fact in a different way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And I think
so. Is this Sean Gorley's voice in this guy?
Yeah, I think a bit of all of us. A bit of all of us is in there.
I see.
Yeah. So I mean, we use. So basically, the trick in this is how do you combine lots of bits of facts. So the snippets of text are kind of bits of templates. But they're stitched together in a way which means that they can convey a very wide amount of information and make it flow naturally, which is not hard. Sorry, which is the hard piece of it. So getting that flow. But we can kind of flip out, what those templates are and how they're expressed. But it's actually, so for briefings, it is much more of an editorial thing. We sit down and we say, well, what kind of information would people want to be exposed to? And what's the right statistics to kind of spot and discover the right information to put out there?
Now, this is completely automated and machine generated, but I imagine there's got to be some QA this thing is not just going to appear automatically online because it might accidentally spit out something offensive, right?
Well, there's no QA.
Oh,
There's no QA. No, it's just, it's
so
what it is.
well,
Yeah.
so there might be an attack on COVID-19 Primer with some garbage articles, so garbage papers.
Yeah. So if you, so if there was a paper that was released and a ton of people tweeted about that paper and described it in offensive language, it may well be that that paper shows up in the briefing and it says, here's the paper and here's some offensive tweets about it. That's very possible.
Right.
So, I mean, this is showing content that that we found. We're not claiming to have arbitrated whether that content is good content, whether it's true, like what kind of opinion it is.
But there's no way this automated model will spit out some swear word or anything, right?
So it could quote somebody who spat out swear words. So it could basically say this person said this, and then what they said could include it. But it would be contextualized as something that they had said. You know, it would be attributed rather than us saying it. And I think what's useful is, so one thing you can do, there's a papers tab. If you click on the papers tab, you can, for any paper, you can click, so you can see the number of news, sorry. For any paper, you can see the number of news articles and tweets that we found about it. And if you click onto those numbers, you can see a sample of the news and the Twitter conversation that we found. And so that's actually very interesting because you can find that there are some papers that are very hard to report on. They're very confusing ones. And you can see this variety of types of way that was written up. And then in the Twitter feed, you can see the ways that people are responding. So you can see conspiracy theorists, for example, saying, oh, this is claimed of this, or people saying, oh, I'm panicking because this is crazy, or, you know, making some kind of claims about it. So you can kind of contextualize that. And to me, that's very useful, right? Because we're, you know, if in your Twitter feed, you come across somebody sharing a link to a piece of content, like they share a link to a paper and they say, hey, this paper is interesting. You're seeing that on its own and without any context as to, is this paper well respected in the scientific community? Is this paper being talked about by a lot of people? Is this paper, you know, has it been withdrawn since it was tweeted? Has it been, you know, you have no context on what this thing is. But if you see that paper and you read it, you might, or even if you just read the title, that might frame your view of what is going on in a very deep, profound way, right? You might kind of believe, you might kind of hook your view about how you should be behaving in the pandemic based on this one paper that was shared with you and you don't have any context. So in my view, kind of giving people ways to find context is very important. So if you see a paper and you want to go and know how different people are talking about it, you can go in and see that, and you can compare it. You can also do things like look at the most tweeted about or the most shared papers and see what they are. And that's going to give you an idea of which science has kind of made it into the public view. And, you know, some of that conversation is unpleasant, right? Like some of the people writing news about the science, some of it, you know, certainly to me reading it, it feels like the take they've had is probably not a real representation of the science, right? So you see that warts and all. And I think, you know, we have to learn to be consumers of information,
right?
Even though often there is a lot of this kind of controversy and ugliness in it, right?
Right.
And we need to think about.
I guess the Daily Digest, as you started out describing these two types of summarization, right? So there's the type where here's a bunch of text, give me a few snippets, representative snippets that summarize all this text. But the Daily Digest is actually kind of this aggregate story for the day, right? So it's like this is the story. These are the highlights of the past day, written in an original way.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so I think what we're able to do is pull in bits from those articles or from the news about them, and kind of, put that up there together to make that an interesting read. um, um, I think today I was just checking what was on the briefing today, and it was calling out the paper from this week that had the most news was one about someone had researched who had hoarded toilet paper. So there's like this survey of who had been hoarding toilet paper, and what that tells us about our collective anxieties, I think. So there was actually, for that one, there was a really long quotation from the author kind of explaining why they thought this was important. But summaries, so we can also talk about summaries, because I think that task is also a very interesting one.
Yeah. So for the people who don't follow text summarization, so how are they judged? So
how are they judged?
what's the metric? So in text classification, right? So either you
Yeah.
classified it properly or not, but text summarization is a bit more ambiguous, right?
Yeah. So there are like kind of automated metrics that are problematic that you can use. I think the gold standard is putting pairs of outputs next to people and saying which one do you prefer. So we have a headline generation summary tool that we've written about on the Primer blog. So the way that we tested headline summarization is you basically put the machine generated title next to the real title that the editor wrote, and you can put it in front of people and say which one do you prefer.
Man, I'd love access to that too.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, it's so the summarization, so it's just come on a very, very long way in the last few years. It's been staggering. So we have an incredible applied research team at Primer who've been, they take the latest models that are out there, and they kind of experiment with them. They do their own kind of tuning and testing, and they've been kind of pushing the boundary continually. And so this week they came out with their latest abstractive summarization model. So this will they can take a news article, say, or another document, and give you like a 2 or 3 line summary of it. And I was blown away, actually, just how far that's come along. So roughly with summarization, there's a couple of methods you can use. So one of them is called extractive. So the idea is you take the long document and you figure out which fragments of it can give you a summary of the whole thing. So which sentences are the most important? And for news, there's often 1 or 2 sentences that are a fairly good representation of the story, because people write in a nice structured way, right? So they'll often kind of write important information and then back it up. And so the piece of information that are important will be repeated. And so you can use a signal within the text of kind of what's getting repeated, how important different bits of text seem to be, to find those sentences and pull those out. And that can be very, very useful. The other type of summarization is called abstractive. So the idea is you want the model to create its own sentences. It doesn't have to be in the original text. And so this is the area where there's been incredible progress. But I think one of the things that's super exciting is actually when you see very good summaries, they actually they feel like they're doing a bit of both. They're finding the very important phrases that were in the document, but they're rewriting them in a way that means you have a paragraph that flows. So it's very exciting. Yeah.
So the site was what was the vision for COVID-19 Primer? This website, was it general public, scientific community, or both? And so obviously I'm part of the general public, and so I am, and a bunch of other people I know. So I think that as far as the general public is concerned, this has been a great service. So what has been the feedback from the scientific community?
Yeah, we've definitely had. So we've had feedback from people who are scientists, who are doctors, actually. One was like an ICU doctor in San Francisco who has been using it a ton. And I think when we were building it, we were thinking of people who, so primarily people who kind of have a job where they need to make sense of it. So yeah, if you think of the doctor,
Yeah, not the
they
research.
have like the most important job out there right now.
Not a research doctor, but a doctor in the front lines, right?
Yeah. So that's it. Doctor on the front line or a research doctor. There's often kind of a team of people in the hospital who have some responsibility for kind of passing it a little bit and then figuring out what to share. So we were definitely thinking about these. We were also thinking about people in kind of the kind of public health spaces. And so we've had people from most of the major public health agencies, international public health agencies, sign up for the weekly newsletter that we've been running. So yes, we were thinking about those. So people who really want to sit down and triage. What I think we've also found is it's very interesting for the general public. So one thing I found fascinating actually is that there's a news tab that shows you basically news about recent papers. And when you scan through that, you get a very different feed than we're normally exposed to, right? And certainly when we were kind of in the height of that first wave and we were learning things so quickly, if you wanted to go and get a very science first feed, like this is an incredible place to see it. So it's basically a feed of, these are news articles that are referencing papers directly, but a variety of them. And you can see they're coming from a very, very wide range of different sources. So some of them are kind of the medical literature. Some of them are mainstream sites that you may have heard of before. But that's been fascinating. So my dad, for example, has been logging in almost every day, and he'll scan through all the latest news from the day and read a bunch of papers and then forward me the coolest ones that he's found. And certainly I think that's I think we're getting about, so we had a lot of people log on the first week, and then we've now got a pretty steady, like about 14,000 people who are kind of regularly active on the site. So there's a pretty large number of people
right.
who are exploring it.
And so Amy, so there's in at a high level, there's two main data sources, right? There's the scientific literature, which comprise of papers and preprints, and then the I guess news, which is comprised of articles and social media. Have you compared? Have you done kind of like a comparison, right? So this is what people are researching, and this is what this is how the media, this is what the media is prioritizing as far as covering.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, you can get a view of that. So if you go onto either the research categories or topics pages, we've got each of these main categories, and then you've got how many papers there are in total, how many of the papers are new, and then how much press coverage there's been, how much social media coverage. So you can see those distributions immediately. I've not looked into that to see if there's kind of
a disconnect.
A disconnect. Yeah. But that would be really interesting. Yeah. That would be really.
So for example, there was maybe a month or so ago, hydrochloroquine, right? So it was probably covered heavily in the media, but maybe in the scientific literature, maybe it was also covered, but maybe not as heavily in the media.
Yeah. Well, and it's certainly true. If you go in and look at the papers that have been most shared, most tweeted about, most shared in the news, they are often kind of controversial. So certainly the most tweeted about ones.
No surprise there.
What's that?
No surprise there, right? So controversy sells, right? So.
Controversy sells. That's right. The ones most shared in the news, I think some of those are the kind of boring but very useful papers, or maybe not boring. Maybe boring is maybe a harsh term for this, but like there's a paper that basically outlines how long the virus seems to live on different surfaces. That one has a huge number of it's been a huge number of links in the news, and some of those links we went back and checked. So I looked at which sources linked most to papers, and the list wasn't what you'd expect. So one of the top 20 was like the Kathmandu Post, for example. When I saw this, I was like, how are they one of the paper? Right. You know, how is this one of the sites that's talking most about scientific literature? And it turns out every single news article they've written, they put an info box at the bottom where they say,
Wow.
Here's the best public health advice we've got so far, and here's a couple of links out to key research that backs that up. And so I think some of those papers that have been very broadly shared in the news, what that is sites that are linking to them over and over and over again as like a, reminder, here's the evidence behind the practices that we're telling you to do. So that might be a kind of better signal.
Now, I'm not sure if this is possible, but and I'm not sure if you folks are actually doing this, but what about a view that compares different geographies? So in other words, in Europe, probably people don't talk about and debate that much the use of masks, but in the US, right? So masks are still not maybe among scientists, but in the media, media is discussed. So is there a view which tells you in Germany, people are talking about this, but in the US, people are doing.
We haven't done that, and it would be very possible because we do have geographic information for those sources.
Awesome.
To where they are based, not necessarily where the readership is, but that would be very interesting. I think the other piece that we've kind of suspected would be interesting is there's actually a big chunk of the research has come out of China. So
right.
If you look at the researchers who produce the most research, one of the things that's incredible is there seems to be a lab that's produced, actually I'm not sure what the latest numbers are, but they had done well over 60 papers like as of even a month or two ago, including some very important ones. And I think it's a group out of the Beijing hospital. Nobody's got a quote. So one of these researchers, I tried to go and find out about the person with the most papers, and I couldn't find anything on who this person was.
Maybe there's quotes, but they're in Chinese language media.
Maybe they're in the Chinese language literature. Yeah, that's right. And maybe there's research that we're missing because we're more focused on the English language press or our local institutions. But there's probably an interesting story there.
But these papers from China are showing up in the same preprint services, same journals, right? So
that's right.
That you folks have some confidence in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's next for COVID-19 Primer?
COVID-19 Primer. Well,
you're the principal product architect. You must have the product roadmap off the top of your head.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were really pleased to have the kind of the chance to build this and put it out there. I think we are kind of, we have to keep going in and making sure it can scale, that it can handle all the content. And so I think that's very important to us. I mean, I think looking forward, we've been having a lot of conversations internally. It's been great to see that people have found this so useful. I think that there are other issues and other areas where the technology that we have would be very useful to people. And so for the most part, we sell to larger enterprises and big organizations. And it's very much something that we care about, kind of finding ways that we can get more of it out into more people's hands. So I think that's the debate we're having internally of what other opportunities do we have to share this.
So
share more of this in
I guess, Amy, for the people who aren't that aware of Primer, but have come across COVID-19 Primer. So how does Primer, the product, compare to COVID-19 Primer, the website? So what's the similarities and differences?
So so the main product gives you much more flexibility, so you can search across different data sets. You can control what kind of content you're getting in. You can manage the sources. We've got a lot of powerful kind of classification technology, so you can drill down into areas that you care about. We've worked closely with clients to kind of make the range of analysis that we're able to do very deep. So that wasn't a very clear summary, I think, but it's much more flexible and powerful. So basically with COVID-19, we've fixed the what content is available, and we've just got this kind of one view that everybody gets.
But clearly, COVID-19 primer is focused on COVID-19, but you folks can easily, as you alluded to, stand up websites for different topics.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think, there are, so what's kind of incredible is watching, so I mean, you mentioned the 5G masts, right, and the conversation around that. So with our core tech, you can actually follow the broad news, whether or not they're talking about scientific papers. So who's talking about this? Where is that conversation coming from around the globe?
I have a website. I have a website that will generate a lot of traffic. I have an idea. Presidential elections 2020.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, unfortunately, I think we are increasingly ever more and more so in a world where understanding data at scale, understanding conversations at scale, trying to figure out what you make of them when there's so much going on and so many kind of forced narratives as well as kind of organic narratives that are all kind of facing off against each other. That's only becoming a more and more acute challenge to kind of stay on top of.
Right. So then, so let's go by kind of just speculating a little bit. So language models have had a great 24 months as far as research. So this research will probably stabilize just like in any other field, right? So there's a burst of innovation, and then now we're probably going to enter kind of more of the productization phase of some of these research, and that's where companies like Primer comes in. So are some of the things that people read about in the media as far as these huge language models, are those going to start appearing in products like Primer, or have they already appeared? Right?
Yeah, I think they're already there. So they're already powering models. So I think there are challenges in kind of making sense of how to use them.
It takes 500,000 to train one of them, right?
That's right. But if you can do a lot, so a lot of them are then published publicly, and there's a lot of ways to remix and build on top of that.
Right.
I think that there are challenges in knowing how to make sense of them. So, for example, classification. Classification is a very useful thing to be able to do, to be able to take documents and be able to say, this one contains this particular fact that I care about and I wanted to see. This one doesn't contain that. So being able to run millions of documents through and find the ones that are important to you. It turns out it's quite hard often to know how to go about labeling data and defining problems such that you can use classification to solve them. And so often that's a challenge of coming up with a precise enough task that people will agree with one another on what the answer is. And then you can kind of go and bring these big machine learning models, big language models in to kind of then automate it. But this is one thing we've seen, and one of the challenges for commercialization, right? Like, so to give you, maybe to kind of explain that in a little bit more depth, right? So I mentioned before this problem of organization extraction from a piece of text. Or people extraction would be another one. So I could give you a document and say, use a highlighter pen and highlight every person's name on this document. Actually, that's not as quite of a clear of a task as that sounds, because if you were to go through, if you saw Amy Heineike, you highlight that, that's fine. But if you saw, Mrs. Amy Heineike, do you highlight the Mrs. or not? If you said, if you saw it say, the host asked the guest, would you highlight host and guest? Are they people or are they kind of roles? And so it actually is a bit tricky. And so if you and I were both doing this task, we might actually label things kind of differently. We would need to have some kind of conversation about what do we mean precisely. Right. And so often I think with classification challenges, people don't realize actually you have to go through this process of deciding what specifically is the challenge we're trying to solve. And how do you, how do you kind of agree such that people would agree well enough that you could possibly have a model go and then solve it for you. But the good thing is that now the quality of the models is such that when you can get to the point where you've done a good job of creating the kind of training for the model is going to do a really good job classifying it for you.
Right.
Yeah, so I think what you see right now is probably more sophisticated. So places that have kind of a more sophisticated understanding of how you utilize have been able to do some really cool things with them already. Places that are just coming into it probably taking kind of steps in and realizing like, oh, there's a bit of a challenge here. It's not quite so easy as turning the crank. Like, I've got to be able to frame the problem in the right way. I've got to be able to define what I'm trying to do well enough that I can use it to achieve the goal that I had. And I think that learning will take some time for people to, for that to become kind of widely understood.
I see. Right. Actually, that's a great point about entity extraction, entity resolution. Still very important task, but still very challenging. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, Amy, this has been great, and thank you so much. And we'll bring you back in the podcast sometime soon.
I would love that. That would be a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You.